Hello. For today's video, I'm just going to talk about the organization structure of a normal German infantry division. So, as you know, different countries throughout the world, their armies have different types of divisions, like tank divisions, light divisions, infantry divisions, motorized divisions. The Americans have marine divisions. But I'll start talking about the infantry division because that's the most common, most simplest, and I'll talk about the German one just because that is a pretty standard one and a more developed type of divisional structure that existed earlier on. So, without further ado, I'll be talking about the standard Wehrmacht Infantry Division. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the ones in 1939 and 1940 a little bit, because those earlier ones were what the later ones were based off of. They had the general structure and the organization that was planned earlier on. And one thing that you have to understand for Wehrmacht infantry divisions is there were different types, different waves. So a wave would be a different type of organization for an infantry division. So wave 1 would be of a certain type, wave 2 were of a certain type. The first 4 waves is what I want to talk about in today's video, just because those were pretty similar structure to each other and would be pretty intuitive to understand. So I'm just going to be using standard NATO organization symbols. Going to try to stray closer to adhere towards the Niehorster variation. If you don't know what that is, it just takes a quick Google search to know what that is. It's pretty simple. It's just a style of organizing and writing down military units. So this is an infantry division. Normally there'd be like numbers here for exactly like which infantry division it is. Infantry division had more or less like 17,000 or so men in it, including command and staff, although it really depended on the specific division. Some divisions were weaker than others. Specifically, if a division was number like 200 something, then it's probably a weaker infantry division rather than those numbered like lower numbers, just because they're like first wave or second wave, whilst like third and fourth waves were tended to be of smaller power. So an infantry division usually consisted of 3 infantry regiments, and these were usually about like 5,000 men strong. And what we call a division with 3 regiments is a triangle division, as opposed to a square division where we have 4 that are split into 2 brigades that a lot of other armies had at this point still. So they had the German army made their infantry divisions have 3 infantry regiments and also 1 artillery regiment. Artillery was also very important because if the infantry were attacking or defending on the front line, the artillery can attack from the rear and could produce more enemy casualties. And that's exactly what they want. And therefore, the artillery usually stuck back, and the infantry regiments would split into left, center, and right and try to fight on. That was typically how they went. Now there were some other support units that were used in infantry divisions as well this included an artillery, an anti-tank battalion, which I think you draw like this usually. This was good at fighting armies with tanks, and in the invasion of France and the invasion of Poland, while the Germans did definitely have strong tanks of their own, you would need guns. Guns were the way to take down enemy tanks, even light tanks, like the ones that the Polish army possessed. And if I can resize this, because there's more I want to talk about. Yeah, so there's this. There's also a reconnaissance battalion. That was also very useful. These were the ones that usually went ahead in the fight, for the most part, and would go ahead of the panzers, ahead of the infantry, and would be very helpful for the fight. You see that invasion of Poland and France, Barbarossa, all alike. Reconnaissance was an important part. And another important one is signals battalion. This is also important. Just keep controlling the telephone lines and the communication lines so that there wouldn't be confusions. There were many scenarios in which bad communication led to complete routes and losses in entire regiments and even divisions. So signal battalions were pretty important for that reason, and so were engineer battalions. So engineer units, sometimes they're written like this, other times I've seen some people just do this to write an engineer battalion. This is fine. An engineer unit is the one that builds the bridges, destroys the bridges, creates you need good engineers in any military campaign, because there will be ground specific scenarios that general soldiers and officers will be unprepared for, and engineers are the ones who are going to do that actual work. And these are the generally considered the fighting forces, although later I'll talk about the extra other types of units that they also possessed, because they're also important too. Okay, I'll talk about it later. So the infantry regiment, it was like 3,000 to 5,000 personnel, and it's made out of 3 infantry battalions, and also 1 artillery battalion. So a regiment, at least in German army, was meant to be rather self-sufficient, so that they could last days without help from other parts of the division, and that they would still be able to last for a certain amount of time. So the German army gave some leeway for the individual regiments, and that's why they'd be split into battalions, with 3 infantry battalions and 2 artillery battalions. Pretty similar structure to that of the division as a whole. You also saw an anti-tank company. An anti-tank company was also important, and then they often had usually not reconnaissance, but maybe a cavalry brigade as well, a company as well, and those would be somewhat useful if they were needed to use horses in some way. Although for the most part, they'd be pretty small. In fact, a lot of times it wouldn't be a company. It'd be like a platoon, or even smaller than that sometimes. But then there are times it reached the size of a company. So anti-tank company, cavalry company or platoon, and they always had their normal signals and engineer companies as well. So just like in the total infantry division, the infantry regiment also needed similarly diverse units in order to really survive in a war setting, because the soldiers are people too, and you got to realize that from a soldier standpoint, they need certain life quality things. They need food, they need water, they need mail, they need transport, things like that, in order to survive. So unless I'm forgetting anything, they also typically had a company of support gun or so, which I guess I could write. They had a company of support gun, although a lot of them got taken out during the invasion of Poland, and but they were really important, for example, in the Norway campaign, like in Narvik and Trondheim, and in the areas north of Oslo, you would find these to be important parts of the infantry regiment. So this is the infantry regiment. Perhaps we can talk about the artillery regiment very briefly. I won't talk about it too in depth because it's not super important to know all of the details of that, because most of the core fighting was based on the infantry, the 3 infantry regiments. But I'm just gonna like put this over here. This is where the artillery regiments were typically in the rear, as I said, I think, and were barraging the enemy from the back. So artillery regiments usually also had like a similar size and personnel to the infantry regiment, and it had 1 heavy artillery battalion and 3 light artillery battalions. So just like how infantry had a 3-to-1 for infantry to artillery, which by the way was mostly light. The artillery regiment was made up of 3 light. I'm just gonna put this for light, and then 1 heavy artillery as well. And this would usually be a good balance, because for things like infantry, attacking infantry, light artillery was sufficient. But as for tanks and in other such encounters of big force like armored cars as well, or even tank destroyers, it would be important to possess heavy artillery. And you'll see the importance of heavy artillery in like the North African campaign, Operation Compass, Operation Crusader, things of that nature. And I guess you can also know that, at least on paper, the battalion usually had 12 pieces of artillery each, and they'd be split among its companies. And light artillery were usually 105 millimeter field howitzers, while heavy artillery were usually 150 millimeter field howitzers. So 150 millimeters could do more damage to armored substances such as armored cars or light tanks, or when they encounter it, medium and heavy tanks, which they would in the French campaign, but not in the Polish campaign. And of course, this earlier on, so is a completely different structure than what would be in later 1944, 1945 types of divisions. So I guess I can write like 1939 because this was really made out of the Polish campaign ones. But I suppose it's also somewhat similar to 1940s as well. Wave 1 through Wave 4 were more or less pretty similar in these organizations, just had different numbers or different, used different types of weapons, different command structures as well. And by the way, all of these units, they always have a head as well. They always have a command company or a command group as well. They be the one who order the division or regiment around. I just didn't include that because then I'd have to include it for everything, which is which I suppose now is possible. So yeah, 12 pieces of artillery for every battalion, which meant that there were 48 pieces of artillery in a single regiment. I can talk about anti-tanks. So anti-tank battalions were also very useful because they dealt with tanks better than most artillery. They had big guns, which are very useful. They often had anti-tank machine guns and cannons as well. Perhaps I don't need to split it, but basically these were made of 3 companies each. Actually, why not? I'll draw the 3 companies. Companies, not platoons. They're usually made up of 3 companies of anti-tanks, and I believe they had 12 anti-tank cannons and 4 machine guns each, which meant that the battalion itself had 36 anti-tank guns, or anti-tank cannons. And you also see, I didn't write down, but anti-aircraft was also used in most divisions, even in short supply. Skip over reconnaissance just because it's not worth digging deep into. The engineer battalion is pretty interesting. They supported the division's advances, constructed roads, bridges, bunkers, naval ports, airfields, you name it. Anything that requires construction and building, that'd be the engineers. Except for like trenches and things like that would be by the main troops. So an engineer battalion usually consists of 3 engineer companies and what was known as a bridge column. So I guess I'll write that down. An engineer battalion usually consists of 3 of these. Plus, they usually had 1 bridge column. So, I'm just gonna write here in small letters, bridge, because I actually don't know how to. Well, I don't think there is an official way to draw bridge units. And after all of these, we also gotta consider the other types of units in an infantry division besides the fighting forces. So yes, there were the command units that I talked about. Command units were very important. They were obviously the ones that led. And there were some supply services as well. That's important to discuss. So these usually consisted of a baker company and a butcher company. So those were the ones that fed the troops, that kept the soldiers with a full stomach. So there's always a baker division. A baker company. There's a butcher company. And as you can probably guess, bakers made bread, and butchers made meat. Usually it was like pork. Sometimes they had chicken. They almost never had beef though. It was mostly they had a lot of pork, at least in the German army. And these were the ones that provided food for the entire division. So if the bakers and the butchers were lost, then the entire division went starving, unless gotten support from the other divisions. So that's why supplies are very important. If you have no supplies and you don't have bakers and butchers, then you're going to die. So what else is there? There's also supply like management groups. They were basically the group that made sure that foods and goods and equipment were transported correctly to the frontline troops, and ensure that the troops would get everything that they needed. They had a supply company, there's repair company as well that repaired certain motorized vehicles, which is also pretty important. And then another pair of important ones were medical services. In an infantry division of pretty much any army, you would have doctors and nurses in it to help the wounded soldiers. And while the Germans in the beginning, like 1939, 1940, didn't face an awful amount of casualties because they were winning, they definitely did needed to provide medical service to those wounded. So it's Red Cross, Swiss Cross. Yeah, so they had a medical company that was motorized, and it was split into two transport columns. Usually they alternated by going like to the front and like back. So these guys were very important for the soldiers' perspective, although they never actually fought. As for a veterinary service, they also had a little vet company as well. It was either a company or platoon. I believe it was a company, same size, that also took care of wounded animals, specifically horses, cavalry. Because if you consider just the amount of cavalry, you don't think there's a lot of cavalry in an infantry division, but actually there's like one every like 30 soldiers or so, which is a lot. And animals needed care as well, so they had a little vet group, although on second thought I don't think it was a company, probably something smaller. So I think this is about it. These are all of the various units that were standard in a Wehrmacht Infantry Division. Wave 1, Wave 2, Wave 3, Wave 4 usually had this structure. Besides the fighting forces, the non-fighting forces were very important as supporters, because you couldn't have it otherwise. You couldn't have a war without these bakers, butchers, and doctors. And I think another thing that I might want to discuss, talking about how the organization of itself, this the main part. If you want to know what's important, it's mostly this. The 30 infantry divisions, the 3 infantry regiments, and 1 artillery regiment are the brunt of the infantry division's force. The rest are all just supporting units, the anti-tank, the engineers, etc. So what did this structure do? Well, unlike that of, say, the Italians, which only usually had 2 regiments, infantry regiments per division, which was, in my opinion, an awful organization, what it allowed was that there's, in a fighting force, you could deploy 3 in this sort of formation. Suppose it's like a flat place, and then the enemy, let's say the enemy is 1 regiment, so you completely outnumber them 3-1. Well, guess what? Instead of them taking 3 times the casualties that you do, they would take about 100 times, or a lot more casualties than 3-1, just because you have this important artillery regiment in the back. So the artillery regiment would be constantly bombarding the enemy regiment, and while there would be some skirmishes, you'd expect that because you outnumber them 3-1, they'd suffer a lot more casualties than you do. So this was deployed very, very nicely and tactically in the German invasion of Poland. So that's why the Poles, despite having a huge, massive army of 1 million and being very well prepared, you have to congratulate them for the preparedness and for their huge recruitment and conscription policy. It's very intense, very rough. And yet the Germans were able to break them with a 2-1 advantage, suffering, and the Poles suffered a much more than 2-1 casualty rate. And in fact, the Polish army, like a majority, I think around 85% or so, were either captured, wounded, or killed. As for the Germans, only about 2% were captured, wounded, or killed. And this is goes down to the small level of an infantry divisional organization, and it will also be important for us later to discuss the advantages of a German Panzer division's organization. So that may be tomorrow's story. But yep, that's this organization complete. Hope you learned a little something from this.